What if dragons were real? Let's build a version that could exist without breaking biology or physics. First, define the creature. A true dragon is a large, flight-capable reptile, with powered, sustained flight and a controlled chemical flamethrower. To keep this plausible, size must respect the same constraints that shaped giant pterosaurs. Think a body mass between 150 and 350 kilograms, a wingspan in the 9 to 12 meter range, hollow but strong bones, and a bird-like respiratory system with air sacs that deliver continuous airflow through the lungs. The torso is deep, with a pronounced keel for the attachment of massive pectoral muscles, and the tail acts as a balancing boom during takeoff and tight banking turns. Scales are keratin over a collagen matrix, with mineralization along the leading edges where abrasion and heat are most intense. Diet and energy set the daily rhythm. A 250-kilogram dragon with an avian-grade metabolism might burn upward of 10,000 to 15,000 kilocalories per day when active. That pushes it toward calorie-dense prey: deer, wild boar, ibex, seals along high-latitude coasts, and large fish in upwelling zones. Scavenging remains valuable. A dragon that can locate carrion from altitude by scent plumes saves energy. Expect a hunting strategy that mixes soaring and ridge lift, short explosive stoops, and ambush glides using terrain masking. Fire is not for every strike. It is a costly tool for special cases like flushing herd animals, collapsing a brush barrier, or defending a nest. How does the fire work? Nature already prototypes chemical heat in the bombardier beetle, which mixes hydroquinones and hydrogen peroxide to reach near boiling spray. Scale the concept. Specialized paired glands store stable precursors separately. Smooth muscle contractions send the fluids into a mixing chamber lined with heat-resistant enamel-like tissue and catalytic enzymes. The reaction produces superheated vapor and combustible aerosol. Ignition is the final obstacle. Two plausible mechanisms exist. One is piezoelectric sparking from crystalline plates embedded near the palate that discharge when flexed. The other is metal microfilaments at the lip edges that heat resistively as the reaction ramps, like a glow plug. Either way, the flame is a brief directed burst with a narrow cone ranging from a few meters to perhaps 15 in optimal conditions. It is loud, bright, and metabolically expensive. Young dragons practice short pulses. Experienced adults meter their fuel like veteran pilots. Flight imposes ruthless trade-offs. Wing loading must stay low to allow slow landing speeds and thermal soaring. Membranes are multi-layered skin with elastin fibers and a web of blood vessels that doubles as a radiator. On hot days, a dragon exposes the wings to crosswinds to dump heat. On cold mornings, it basks to warm the flight muscles, then launches with a running start downslope the way large condors do. The sternum's keel and a wishbone-like structure distribute loads during wing beats. The neck stays relatively short to keep the center of mass close to the shoulder joint. Long swan-like necks look dramatic but would punish balance in a crosswind. Intelligence sits just above the corvid and dolphin tier. A dragon benefits from planning routes around wind layers, synchronizing hunts with a mate, and remembering seasonal prey movements. Tool use emerges in simple forms, pushing stones to trigger rock slides that scatter goats, collecting dry twigs into a shallow bowl so a short flame pulse generates smoke and panic, or dropping bones onto hard ground to crack them for marrow. Communication blends posture, low-frequency rumbles that carry over valleys, and brief flame puffs as visual punctuation in twilight. Reproduction follows a K-selected pattern. A pair bonds for seasons or for life, depending on species. Nests are on inaccessible ledges or volcanic outcrops where updrafts assist fledglings. Clutch size is small, 1 to 3 eggs laid on a staggered schedule to hedge against failure. Parental care is intense for the first year, food provisioning, wing exercise on thermals, and strict territorial defense. Juveniles reach flight competence within months but require years to perfect energy-efficient soaring and fire control. Mortality is highest during the first solo hunts. A single misjudged downdraft or a failed landing can be fatal. To keep the picture organized, consider 3 ecological variants. The mountain wyvern favors ridgelines and dry thermals. The coastal drake exploits sea breezes, cliffs, and rich marine prey. The forest basilisk trades wingspan for maneuverability, relying more on gliding between emergent trees and short bursts, rather than long soaring flights. Each variant pressures human societies in different ways, shapes distinct myths, and demands tailored responses in policy, conservation, and conflict. Habitats determine everything about draconic life and the human responses that follow. Mountain wyverns hold the longest, windiest territories, mapping their lives to ridgelines, cirques, and canyon mouths where thermals rise predictably. They prefer arid, high-insulation ranges with strong day-night temperature swings that generate lift. Nests are placed on sunlit ledges facing prevailing winds, often reused for decades, layered with bone fragments, shed scales, and mineral-stiffened fibers. Coastal drakes concentrate along sea cliffs, fjords, and islands where onshore breezes and seabird colonies provide both lift and food. They cruise convergence zones and exploit upwelling fisheries, switching between pinniped pups in spring and schooling fish in late summer. Forest basilisks tolerate lower ceilings by trading wingspan for agility. They commute along river corridors, launch from emergent trees, and hunt edge habitats where deer step from cover. All three avoid heavy, saturated air. Extended storms pin them down and can starve juveniles not yet skilled at energy budgeting. Global range tracks mountains, coasts, and big herbivore biomass. Imagine a belt running through the Andes, Rockies, Sierra Madre, and Appalachian highlands, another looping across the Atlas, Alps, Caucasus, Himalaya, and Hengduan ranges into the Japanese archipelago. Island arcs from the Faroes to Iceland. Coastal bands along Namibia's skeleton coast, Patagonia's cliffs, and New Zealand's fjords. True deserts lack thermals at night and prey by day, so dragons skirt them along mountain rims. Equatorial rainforests are viable only for the smaller, gliding-adapted lineages. At carrying capacity, territorial spacing is wide, roughly one breeding pair per 500 to 1,000 square kilometers in prime mountains, sparser elsewhere. Total global numbers would be low, perhaps tens of thousands across all species, creating a creature at once ubiquitous in story and rare in sight. Seasonal movement resembles raptor migration more than whale journeys. Individuals surf as utherms and barometric fronts, leapfrogging ridge to ridge. Known dragon roads would be cultural facts. Autumn corridors where livestock are penned early and herders keep watch. Spring avenues where fish traps are covered and cliff paths are closed. Rural calendars would mark fledgling weeks the way communities mark wildfire season, because fledglings crash, panic, and experiment with flame in all the wrong places. If dragons had always been present, human history bends early. Pleistocene hunters would learn quickly that open fires attract curious scavengers from above. Hearth management evolves into smoke discipline. Banks of damp fuel that produce smell without open flame, rock overhangs that mask heat signatures, and camp layouts with nets strung between poles to deter stoops. Cave art gains silhouettes not of fantasy but field observation. Wing shapes, tail rudders, the kinked angle of a banking turn. Myth grows from risk management. Offerings at high places aren't just reverence, they are payment to keep a pair distracted during a migration pulse. Agriculture creates new tensions and opportunities. Grain draws ungulates, ungulates draw dragons. Early villages adopt anti-dragon architecture, steep, overhanging eaves. Tiled, heat-resistant roofs, narrow lanes that deny a glide path. Hearth chimneys with caps to disrupt thermal plumes. Watchtowers become a standard feature where valleys open to ridges, not only for raiders but for talons. Falconry traditions develop heavier cousins. Horn and drum signals to warn of circling shapes, leather spark cloaks for shepherds, reflective kite shields that throw glare upward. States assert authority over the sky with ridge beacons and organized fire crews. Taxes are partially paid and meat delivered to designated feeding cliffs to divert predation from herds. Classical warfare changes under a real aerial apex predator. Open field torches become liabilities. Armies march at dawn and dusk to avoid thermal peaks. Carry net catapults that throw weighted mesh into an oncoming dive, and deploy portable shade screens that break up heat shimmer. Siege engines evolve with upward angles and barbed bolts designed to snag wing membranes rather than pierce scales. Dragon bounties exist, but so do sanctuaries. Killing a nesting pair brings famine-level rodent booms and wildfire risk. Lessons learned the hard way and preserved in law codes that mix reverence with pragmatism. Trade emerges around dragon products and precautions. Scales are valued as abrasion-resistant inlays for tools and ceremonial armor. The chemical precursors from fire glands recovered from carcasses, not easily harvested live, become controlled substances in ancient apothecaries, used sparingly for sterilization or pyrotechnics. Guilds of wind readers sell route guidance to caravans and ships, forecasting lift, downdraft traps, and migratory waves. Coastal towns string heavy rope grids above markets to deny stoops. Lighthouse keepers maintain smoke pots that mark human zones the way farmers ring fields with wind chimes. Religion and art integrate biology. High places double as sacred and regulated airspace. Festival calendars avoid fledging weeks out of respect and self-preservation. Literature treats dragons less as unknowable monsters and more as seasonal powers. Risky neighbors, sometimes allies against worse plagues, sometimes catastrophes with shadows that drink the sun. Languages acquire precise words for lift, lee, and the sound of a throat-priming fuel. Modern life, with real dragons, forces airspace, fire, and urban design to evolve together. Aviation goes first. Air traffic control would maintain dynamic wildlife corridors, published like seasonal NOTAMs but updated hourly from satellite tags, thermal cameras on ridgelines, and infrasound microphones that detect wing beats and roar primes. Commercial jets already cruise above typical soaring layers, but climb and descent profiles would shift to avoid ridge lift where dragons commute. Regional turboprops and helicopters face the highest risk. Routes thread valleys where thermals are strongest. Operators adopt cold climb procedures on summer afternoons, flatter power settings and altered headings that keep aircraft out of updraft streets. Helicopter firefighting adds belly nets that can be jettisoned if a dragon stoops. Rotorcraft pilots train to dive toward lee-side sink, where large gliders struggle to follow. Drones get geofenced hard. Recreational quadcopters and delivery fleets are barred from migration corridors, while certified survey drones carry strobe codes audible in the low-frequency range, warning dragons away like maritime foghorns for the sky. Aviation safety culture absorbs new protocols akin to bird strike playbooks but scaled up. Cockpit checklists include flame event contingencies, dump cabin fresh air intake to recirc if a heat plume crosses the nose, descend below the convective layer, report bearing and altitude to the wildlife desk. Airports near mountain fronts build perimeter masts with thermal imagers and skyward litter, feeding a public dashboard of lift maps so departures avoid fresh thermals. Insurance underwriters price premiums by proximity to dragon roads, day of year and time of day, just as they already do with hail risk. Wildfire management becomes both easier and harder. Dragons ignite edges intentionally to flush prey, but they also create patchwork mosaics that can reduce catastrophic fuel loads if the behavior is seasonal and predictable. Agencies formalize dragon burn windows, suspending suppression in remote zones where small, rapid mosaic fires benefit ecosystems. The problem is fledglings and drought years. Juveniles experiment with fire without an ecological plan. Drought turns any spark into a crown run. Fire crews carry upward-facing mesh screens for safe staging, deploy acoustic deterrents that emit short infrasonic pulses during red flag days, and fly night ops when thermals collapse and dragons roost. Liability law distinguishes between natural ignition by protected wildlife and negligent human amplification. Utility companies harden lines not only against wind, but against heat pulses, with ceramic shields on exposed spans in dragon country. Conservation politics splits along familiar lines. Charismatic apex predator love meets rural fatigue. Populations are naturally sparse, reproduction slow, and poaching lucrative. An international treaty, functionally a site annex, targets trade in scales and fire gland derivatives, with forensic chemistry that fingerprints a region based on trace metals. Community-based conservation is non-negotiable. Villages inside buffer zones receive guaranteed livestock compensation within 72 hours of verified kills, funded by levies on ecotourism and carbon markets that credit dragon-managed fire mosaics for reducing megafires. Indigenous co-management boards control nesting cliffs on ancestral lands, blending traditional protocols with telemetry. A narrow, controversial quota in some countries permits problem individuals to be removed or translocated. The policy tension mirrors big cat management, and the politics are equally charged. Economically, coexistence creates entire sectors. Sky ecology forecasters sell subscription lift models to airlines, glider clubs, and ranchers planning herd movements. Outfitters run legal viewing expeditions with strict standoff distances and no-ignite seasons to minimize disturbance. Urban fireworks pivot to drone light shows by default. Where pyrotechnics remain, cities activate cold roofs and misting to flatten thermals before events. A persistent criminal market pushes worm oil as a miracle fuel or medicine. Regulators chase it with lab assays and public education, and courts impose penalties on par with rhino horn trafficking. Cities redesign their skylines. Building codes in dragon regions require overhanging cornices and anti-perch geometry on towers, breaking long, inviting ledges into interrupted, downward-sloped segments. Rooftops shift toward cool, low-contrast surfaces. Green roofs get embedded mist lines that dump heat during migration pulses, making buildings aerodynamically boring from above. Chimneys and industrial stacks add baffles that disrupt vertical plumes, reducing the visual and thermal cues that attract curiosity. Stadiums install retractable mesh canopies that both shade spectators and deny glide paths. Transit authorities thread aerial catenaries with visible pennants so high-speed silhouettes read as obstacles to a stooping predator. Street design introduces sky alleys, narrow corridors aligned with prevailing winds to shepherd lift between blocks and keep public squares in sync zones. Glass facades carry patterned films tuned to a dragon's visual spectrum, preventing mirror-like reflections that could invite approaches. Public safety drills normalize a few simple rules. Avoid clustering under open heat sources during migration. Carry reflective panels in rural school packs for visual deterrence, and report sightings with altitude, heading and behavior tags. Shelter design in fire country adds upward egress hatches with radiant barriers, meant as last-ditch refuges from both wildland fire and accidental flame bursts. Technology knits it all together. Satellite tags recharge from solar patches built into wing membrane harnesses that shed as the animal grows. Reducing long-term encumbrance, machine learning models fuse radar angels, thermal signatures, and citizen reports into hour-by-hour risk maps. The result is not a war for the sky, but a managed sharing of it. Part meteorology, part ecology, part etiquette at continental scale. Law, ethics, and culture bend around real dragons the way maritime societies bent around oceans. Start with the question of status. Most jurisdictions would recognize dragons as protected wildlife with enhanced provisions due to intelligence and ecological role, but not as legal persons. That middle ground creates a stewardship model. Strong penalties for poaching, habitat disturbance, or trafficking in scales and fire gland precursors. Mandated compensation funds for verified livestock losses, and strict licensing for deterrence. A Sky Commons doctrine emerges in law, treating lift corridors like rivers, public goods that require cooperative management. Airspace rules incorporate seasonal closures above nesting cliffs, drone blackouts during fledging weeks, and emergency waivers for fire response. Where dragons are urban-adjacent, municipalities add no-flame bylaws on high thermal days and require buildings to carry perch-deterrent geometry. Courts refine liability around natural ignition. A dragon-initiated burn is force majeure unless a human activity amplified it, say unmanaged/piles, which shifts costs back onto the party that created unusual fuel continuity. Ethics debates move beyond resource harm to cognition. If problem-solving and culture transmission are evident, regional hunting styles, handedness in handling prey, dialect-like vocal patterns, then minimum welfare standards follow. No live capture for entertainment, no invasive tagging except under strict scientific review, and translocation before lethal removal. A small camp argues for limited personhood akin to great apes or cetaceans, emphasizing autonomy and the right to undisturbed breeding grounds. Opponents note the risks. A being that can torch a hillside cannot fit ordinary consent frameworks. The compromise is a dragon ethics code adopted by parks and research bodies, least intrusion monitoring, seasonal quiet zones, and an obligation to engineer around dragons, rather than force dragons to adapt to us when feasible. Policing and security adopt a tiered response. Unauthorized harassment, flares, or baiting triggers fines and gear seizure. Intentional harm escalates to felony charges tied to organized wildlife crime, with financial tracking focusing on worm oil and scale markets. Military doctrines quietly add no-engagement corridors and non-lethal haze kits for bases near migration routes. Rules of engagement restrict lethal force to imminent threat conditions. Repeated stoops at fuel depots, assaults on civilian aircraft, or nest establishment on critical infrastructure with failed relocation attempts. Prosecutors learn to present thermal data and flight path models to juries. Defense attorneys argue misidentification and natural behavior. Culture reshapes around coexistence rather than conquest. Festivals move from fireworks to sky lanterns made of cool LEDs. Where flame remains, it's tightly scheduled outside migration windows. Visual arts embrace accurate anatomy, arm bones inside the wing membrane, keel-heavy chests turning field guide aesthetics into popular design. Sports evolve lift runs, long-distance paragliding, and trail events that harmonize with dragon corridors. Athletes brag about personal bests without disturbing roosts. Food culture shifts in ranching regions toward dragon-safe practices. Night corralling during peak thermals, reflective foils on lambing pens, guardian animals trained to respond to shadow and sound cues rather than only ground predators. Religion integrates stewardship into liturgy. Mountain shrines double as monitoring stations staffed by lay volunteers who maintain windsocks and log sightings. Pilgrimages route along ridge trails with posted etiquette. No fires above tree line, no approach within a set radius of active nests, offerings limited to biodegradable materials. Sermons and teachings use dragons as metaphors for power correctly held, dangerous, beautiful, bounded by duty. Theologies diverge on meaning. Some read dragons as reminders of creation's wild freedom, others as tests of humility, insisting humans cannot own the sky. Media and education act as the glue. Newsrooms maintain wildlife desks that understand thermals and migration. Breaking coverage moves away from sensational attack language toward incident typologies, defensive stoop, opportunistic scavenging, fledgling misfire. Social platforms flag counterfeit dragon strike clips with forensic heat and wingbeat analysis. Crowdsourcing debunks. Schools fold sky literacy into curricula by 4th grade. How to read a lift map, when to shelter, how to photograph responsibly, why fledging weeks matter. Science classes build simple gliders to illustrate wing loading, link chemistry labs to safe exothermic reactions, and compare bombardier beetles to draconic fire physiology. University programs spin up aeroecology majors that sit at the intersection of wildlife biology, meteorology, and urban planning. The arts and narrative traditions do what they always do: metabolize risk into meaning. Dragon stories shift from slaying to negotiating boundaries, from treasure hoards to ecosystem services, from singular monsters to regional cultures of scaled neighbors. The result isn't utopia, it's competence. Communities become fluent in the weather of wings, and the presence of dragons forces us to practice a politics of limits, where not every place can be built, not every fire can be lit, and not every sky can be flown. Geopolitics gets weird when the sky itself becomes contested habitat. Borders on maps don't align with ridge lift, so states create transboundary lift corridors, managed like shared rivers. Think of joint commissions that publish seasonal sky charts, coordinate temporary closures during fledging weeks, and standardize non-lethal deterrents so dragons don't encounter a patchwork of confusing signals each time they cross a frontier. These bodies sit between aviation regulators and wildlife agencies, backed by mutual aid pacts for wildfire sparked by draconic activity. A small but crucial clause appears in bilateral treaties. No military exploitation of dragon behavior, no baiting a stoop over enemy lines, no incendiary lures near civilian targets, and no jamming of telemetry tags except during declared emergencies with third-party monitors observing. Sanctuaries that straddle nations become crucibles for cooperation. A Himalayan chain reserve or an Andes corridor would string protected ledges across 3 or more countries, with shared ranger academies, common evidence standards for poaching prosecutions and interoperable radio networks. Revenue sharing from ecotourism smooths tensions. Permits are capped across the entire corridor and money flows back to communities on both sides of the line, according to verified nesting success, not just tourist headcounts. Satellite tagging data is anonymized in public feeds, but decrypted in secure rooms where joint committees plan fire breaks, aerial traffic reroutes, and seasonal grazing rotations to reduce conflict. The payoff is resilience. When drought collapses prey in one state, dragons can shift along the corridor without triggering panic or retaliatory kills. Warfare and insurgency complicate everything. International humanitarian law extends no-strike rules to active nests and designated refuges. Commanders are briefed that torching a sanctuary is a reputational catastrophe and likely a war crime if civilians depend on that ecosystem's fire mosaic. Insurgent groups may try to monetize scales and gland products or even weaponize curiosity with heat lures near convoys. Professional militaries counter with non-lethal haze kits, acoustic deterrence at bases, and strict protocols against firing at silhouettes without positive ID. Radar returns from a banking dragon can resemble low-flying drones. Peacekeepers inherit a new task, protecting telemetry stations and ridge beacons because turning off the sky map creates chaos that helps smugglers and spoilers. Coasts add another layer. Coastal drakes cross exclusive economic zones as if they don't exist, while offshore rigs and wind farms become perches and hazards. Maritime law starts speaking the language of altitude. Vertical safety buffers above platforms, seasonal shutdowns for blade maintenance during migration, and compensation funds for fishing fleets that lose catch to dragon harassment in choke points. Navies adapt lookout drills to include upward sweeps. Shipboard infrared systems classify heat plumes, so crews don't confuse a dragon's ignition with incoming ordnance. The black market is resilient but not omnipotent. Worm oil is pushed as a miracle fuel and aphrodisiac. Scales are carved into prestige inlays. Fossil bones are laundered as fresh trophies. Enforcement relies on 3 tools. Isotopic fingerprinting that ties seized material to a specific geological region. Financial surveillance that flags trade bursts along known smuggling routes, and quick-turn community compensation that undercuts the incentives for villagers to collude. Synthetic biology threatens to blur lines as labs attempt to produce gland analogs. Regulators respond by licensing safe substitutes for industrial use, shrinking demand for wild harvest while keeping criminal penalties high. Climate change redraws the strategic map. As heat and drought intensify, dragons spend more time near reservoirs and hydroelectric dams, which are transboundary flashpoints already. States quietly accuse each other of manipulating habitats, burning ridgelines to push dragons into rival airspace, seeding bait herds to keep them home during tourism season. Satellite-aided auditors and civil society watchdogs become essential, publishing lift anomaly indices and nest success rates to cool conspiracy theories. Insurance and credit markets start pricing sovereign risk by aeroecological governance. Do you manage your sky like a commons or like a cockpit? Intelligence services try and sometimes fail to co-opt the network. Real-time tag data is valuable for monitoring remote mountain passes. Treaties therefore require open publication with limited latency, plus independent servers housed in neutral states. Attempts to jam or spoof signals are detectable and diplomatically costly. Diplomacy adapts with new roles, aeroecology attachés at embassies, ridge liaison officers embedded with border forces, and fast channels between meteorological agencies when a migration pulse is imminent. Science and medicine turn dragons from myth into manageable biology. Start with baseline health. A large flighted reptile with avian-style lungs is vulnerable to respiratory issues. air sac infections from fungal spores along damp cliffs, bacterial pneumonia after smoke inhalation during drought years, and aspergillosis outbreaks in rookeries with poor ventilation. Wing membranes are living skin, so they tear, sunburn, and develop fungal dermatitis much like bats. Field repair kits carry sterile hydrogel patches and absorbable sutures with elastic patterns that preserve stretch. Metabolism is high for a reptile closer to a condor than a crocodile, so starvation hits fast. Lead toxicosis appears where carrion is contaminated by ammunition. PFAS and mercury bioaccumulate in coastal drakes feeding high in marine food webs. Fire gland anatomy adds failure modes. Duct obstructions, abscesses from mouth flora migrating upstream. Chemical imbalances that misfire the reaction and cause internal burns. Juveniles experimenting with ignition suffer the majority of oral lesions and feathering of enamel-like mouth linings. Zoonotic risk management borrows from raptor and bat work. Salmonella-like enterics live in the gut, so scat handling demands gloves and disinfectants. Paramyxoviruses and influenza analogs could circulate in mixed colonies of seabirds and coastal drakes. Surveillance focuses on serology from shed blood in feeding scrapes and PCR from eDNA collected in nest runoff. Rabies is unlikely in a reptile lineage, but lyssavirus relatives can surprise. Post-exposure protocols for bite or claw wounds still apply. Field teams use P100 respirators inside rookeries during fungal seasons, flame-resistant outerwear during fledging weeks, and heat dose meters that warn when ambient plus radiant exposure approaches tissue damage thresholds. Veterinary care adapts from avian anesthesia and wildlife immobilization. Sedation risks are high: hollow bones, large air sacs, and heat-sensitive chemistry in the throat. Isoflurane via mask is possible for short procedures if the fire glands are flushed or temporarily clamped. Longer surgeries use intubation with cuffed tracheal tubes sized for ostriches, guided by endoscopy to avoid gland ducts. Intravenous access runs through the jugular or superficial brachial vessels along the wing root. Analgesia leans on meloxicam and carefully dosed opioids. Reptiles metabolize differently, so telemetry collars record activity to titrate pain relief without suppressing respiration. Nutrition during rehab centers on high-protein, calcium-balanced diets. Ground ungulate with bone meal for mountain wyverns, fish and seal blend for coastal drakes, and iron monitoring to prevent overload in captives that aren't flying enough to use their massive flight muscles. Rescue operations follow a standardized chain. Triage in the field assesses airway and heat injury. Soot in nares and mouth. Singed palatal tissue. Wing membrane translucency indicating loss of collagen integrity. Burns get cooled with sterile saline, not gel that traps heat. Fractures are stabilized with lightweight carbon splints. Humeral breaks have poor prognosis due to weight-bearing stresses, while distal membrane tears often heal if edges are aligned. Electrocution on transmission lines presents as entry showish into burns and arrhythmias. Portable ultrasound and ECG guide treatment, and utilities in dragon regions retrofit lines with perch guards and insulating spacers to prevent repeat incidents. Release strategy is soft, a ridge pen with wind exposure for strength rebuilding. Minimal human contact. Then dawn release into guaranteed lift with a GPS tag and a week of remote feeding drops. Diagnostics blend classic and novel. Thermal cameras map inflammation across wing membranes. Portable radiography checks for keel and furcula stress fractures from hard landings. Endoscopy inspects fire mixing chambers. Bronchoscopy surveys the parabronchial lungs for fungal plaques. Breath analysis via portable gas chromatography reads the ratios of hydrocarbon precursors. Abnormal profiles predict misfires before they happen. Stable isotope analysis from a single scale reveals diet shifts and poisoning risk. Satellite tags log climb rates and wing beat frequency to flag subclinical illness. Dragons with infections flap more and climb less per unit lift. Population health relies on non-invasive sampling. Drones collect shed scales from roost ledges. eDNA samplers sit in drip lines below nests. Acoustic arrays pick up low-frequency contact calls. Machine learning detects changes that correlate with stress or disease. Telemetry harnesses are solar elastic and programmed to auto-release as the animal grows. Data flows into open dashboards with a short delay to protect nests while giving pilots, firefighters, and ranchers hour-by-hour risk maps. Non-lethal deterrents work best when varied. Overhead grid wires and reflective streamers discourage stoops on small livestock. Thermal decoys draw curiosity away from barns during migration. Cooled roofs plus a distant warm rock pile beat direct confrontation. Acoustic devices emit short infrasound pulses only during red flag days to avoid habituation. Guardian animals help at ground level, but the real win is landscape design. Lambing pens under netted shade, carcass removal within 24 hours to reduce baiting, and rotational grazing that keeps herds out of glide lanes at peak thermals. The medical and technological toolkit doesn't turn dragons tame, it keeps them healthy at population scale and keeps people predictable neighbors rather than accidental threats. Consider the sudden emergence case rather than a world that evolved alongside dragons. Start with a 1-year timeline built on today's conditions. Day 0 sees viral footage, aviation advisories, and a rapid risk triage. Airspace regulators issue temporary flight restrictions around the sighting region and elevate bird strike protocols to large soaring animal advisories. Fire agencies place standby crews along ridge lines even if no flames are reported, anticipating panicked brush ignitions or fledgling misfires once more individuals appear. Public health institutes release a conservative guidance note: avoid carcasses, do not approach, treat scat as biohazard. Newsrooms amplify both fear and awe. Officials pivot to calm, actionable instructions and promise transparent data. Week 1 to 4 is stabilization. A science consortium forms across wildlife biology, aeroecology, chemistry, and veterinary medicine. The goals are specimen-free, high-resolution imagery, shed scales, scat, and acoustic recordings. Naming debates start early. Whether to treat dragon as colloquial or assign a neutral taxonomic label, while governments argue over jurisdiction for tagging. Non-lethal deterrent protocols are drafted quickly. Reflective streamers for ranches, dusk curfews for open-air events in ridge towns, and voluntary drone stand-downs within a radius of confirmed activity. Insurance carriers create provisional codes for aerial megafauna interaction, triggering claims documentation standards and premium surcharges near thermally active terrain. Month 2 to 3 brings engineering responses. Airports near mountain fronts install temporary skyward lidar, thermal cameras, and infrasound microphones. Departure and arrival procedures are reprofiled to minimize time spent inside convective layers. Helicopter operations receive new guidelines for maintaining safe sink corridors and quick-release cargo if a stoop occurs. Utilities in dragon regions schedule inspections of exposed spans, adding ceramic shields on critical runs. Agricultural agencies distribute free deterrent kits, overhead wires, netting, reflective panels, and set up a 72-hour livestock compensation program for verified losses, funded by emergency appropriations to keep rural buy-in. Months 4 to 6 are legal and cultural groundwork. Legislatures pass interim protections against harassment, capture, and trade, paired with clear carve-outs for emergency public safety actions. Wildlife crimes are bundled with organized trafficking statutes to deter early black market interest in scales and gland byproducts. Municipalities adopt cool roof guidance and discourage rooftop fires on high thermal days. Schools pilot age-appropriate sky literacy, how to report a sighting with altitude and heading, why fledging weeks matter, when to shelter. Media-style guides shift from sensational verbs to standardized incident categories, which helps de-escalate public reaction and keeps data clean for analysis. Months 7 to 12 shift from reaction to management. Designated sanctuaries are proposed along ridge chains with minimal human footprint. Outside those zones, published lift corridors and seasonal closures reduce accidental conflicts. Tourism emerges with strict distance rules and booking caps. Ranger staffing increases and visitor centers teach wind and thermals alongside biology. Research priorities mature. Breath chemistry to understand ignition precursors, membrane healing studies for rescue, and telemetry that auto-releases as juveniles grow. A first international working group convenes to align deterrent signals, data sharing latencies, and enforcement against cross-border trafficking. Incidents will happen. A small aircraft encounters a heat plume during climb. A fledgling ignites stubble near a town edge. A poacher tests the market with a smuggled gland. Each event rewrites protocols. Aviation learns to treat reported flame events like microbursts, report, reroute, descend into sync if safe. Fire agencies formalize dragon burn windows, where mosaic burns are allowed to run in remote areas under watch, while red flag days trigger acoustic deterrence and aggressive initial attack. Courts clarify liability. Natural ignition remains force majeure unless a human-created unusual fuel continuity or violated closure orders. Project 10 years forward. Building codes in Dragon Country require overhanging cornices, anti-perch geometry, cool roofs with mist lines, and baffled exhausts that diffuse plumes. Drone industries rebound with certified sky-courteous platforms that broadcast low-frequency warning beacons and respect dynamic geofences. Airlines subscribe to lift forecasts the way they buy turbulence products today. Rural broadband improves because telemetry and lift mapping demand persistent coverage. Conservation funding stabilizes through a blend of tourism fees, insurance levies, and climate credits for reduced megafire risk where dragons maintain patch mosaics. University programs graduate cohorts fluent in meteorology, animal behavior, and urban design. Risks remain. Climate extremes can synchronize drought, prey collapse, and human fire danger into a single volatile season. Retaliatory killings in unprepared regions can unravel trust and trigger black market booms. Geopolitics occasionally tests the norm against weaponizing curiosity with heat lures. The counterweight is competence, transparent data, fast compensation, consistent deterrence, and a civic culture that treats the sky as shared infrastructure. The sudden emergence world doesn't need heroics, it needs institutions that can learn quickly in the weather of wings. Case studies make the world feel solid. So consider 3 places that would anchor policy, culture, and economics around dragons. Begin with the Colorado Front Range. Mountain wyverns nest on south-facing bands above timberline and commute along the long, predictable thermals that form over foothill hogbacks. Municipalities from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs adopt ridge quiet hours on high-index thermal afternoons. Construction activities that vent heat are minimized, drone flights are geofenced, and large outdoor events schedule shaded intermissions to reduce upward plumes. Ranchers on the eastern plains adjust calving calendars to avoid fledging weeks. Lambing pens move beneath tensile netting that breaks glide paths. The state's insurance pool funds a fast-turn compensation program for verified kills, and in exchange, landowners agree to carcass removal within 24 hours to avoid bait dynamics. Recreation changes too. Trail associations publish weekly lift maps alongside avalanche forecasts. Paraglider clubs and raptor monitors share radio channels to report active corridors. When smoke season coincides with juvenile practice burns, counties stage roaming fire patrols with upward-facing mesh screens and infrared spotters. Small brush ignitions are allowed to run in mosaic where safe, shifting suppression to the edges. Tourism evolves into sky literacy weekends in mountain towns. Guided viewpoint walks, thermal reading workshops, and dawn viewing blinds set at legal distances from traditional ledges. Shift to the Indian Himalaya, across Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh into Nepal. Sanctuaries here are transboundary by necessity, stitched along pilgrimage circuits and high passes. Gram Sabhas and community forest councils co-manage ledges, mixing traditional prohibitions: no noise, no fires above a certain altitude during nesting, with modern telemetry hubs powered by microgrids. Porters and tea house owners become frontline stewards, logging sightings on paper ledgers that sync when cell coverage returns. Religious practice aligns with stewardship. Certain feast days add offerings of salt blocks or carrion at designated decoy cliffs to distract dragons from goat trails during heavy trekker traffic. The Army and Border Forces maintain codified non-lethal haze protocols. Reflective pennants on ridge outposts, acoustic pulses only on red flag days, and a shared hotline with civil authorities to coordinate closures when a migration wave stacks up over a pass. Hydropower operators retrofit intake towers with radiant barriers. In drought, heat plumes from dams can pull curious adults into dangerous proximity. An annual corridor festival rotates between valleys, distributing tourism revenue and reinforcing norms: no drones, no flash photography at dusk, and fines that fund emergency fodder banks for herders hit by predation. Now look to the North Atlantic island arc from the Faroes, through Iceland, to Jan Mayen, where coastal drakes rule. Fisheries, seabird cliffs, and wind farms overlap in a tight geography that demands choreography. Wind operators schedule blade maintenance and idle turbines during migration pulses. Radar and thermal feed a public blue-green index that shows when sea breezes make the cliffs busiest. Fishers adapt net sets to avoid surface schooling hours favored by dragons. In return, maritime authorities compensate for verified catch displacement, using a formula tied to telemetry density and fish stock assessments. Lighthouse services add skyward beacons that use low-frequency tones, audible to drakes, unobtrusive to humans, to mock harbor approaches as no-stoop zones. Coastal towns build market roofs with downward-sloped ridges and mist lines that flatten midday thermals. Summer festivals swap fireworks for choreographed light sails. Children learn to fold reflective pennants that double as emergency signal tools on cliff walks. Rescue culture evolves with precision. When a juvenile crashes on scree, volunteer teams deploy collapsible shade, saline sprayers, and carbon fiber splints, while a ranger clears a cool glide lane for release at first evening breeze. Scientific life is woven in. University labs monitor breath chemistry at feeding scrapes via remote samplers, correlating hydrocarbon ratios with diet shifts from puffin colonies to capelin booms. Data is open by default with a 24-hour delay, enough to protect active roosts, while giving pilots and skippers actionable situational awareness. These places show a pattern. When institutions treat lift, heat, and curiosity as infrastructure rather than surprises, conflict declines and benefits compound. The policies are specific to terrain but rhyme in principle: transparent data, fast compensation, minimal mixed signals, and a cultural shift from spectacle to competence. Continue to explore dragon-inspired technology and design, materials, energy systems, architecture, and biomimicry drawn from wings, scales, and controlled combustion. Technology and design would rip ideas from dragon biology and translate them into hardware. Start with materials. Overlapping scales suggest gradient composites, a tough, slightly elastic base like collagen, transitioning into a mineral-rich, abrasion-proof outer layer. In practice, that means ceramic-infused polymer tiles that lock like shingles. Each piece free to flex a few degrees so impacts dissipate along the array, instead of cracking a single rigid plate. Edges can be surface-hardened with boron or silicon carbide, while the core stays resilient, mirroring how leading-edge scales resist scouring without turning the whole skin brittle. Near the mouth, dragons need enamel-like heat-resistant tissue. The analog in engineering is an ultra-thin refractory glaze over a thermal barrier foam. Firefighting gear, kiln doors, and drone housings for hot environments all benefit from that layering. Wing membranes inspire self-healing films, elastomer sheets with micro-encapsulated resin that ruptures when torn, polymerizing under UV to close pinholes. Add embedded microchannels for coolant, water, or dielectric fluid, and the film doubles as a radiator, the way vascularized wings dump heat on a summer updraft. Controlled combustion gets safer by copying gland architecture. The key is separation and metering. Dual cartridge microreactors store stable precursors apart. Check valves and catalytic grids ensure ignition only when both flows arrive in the right ratio. A piezoelectric igniter flexes under a trigger to produce a spark, simple, durable, and battery light. The output is a burst-length flame, not a continuous inferno. That has use cases: emergency de-icing for aircraft leading edges or turbine blades when electrical heaters fail, rapid sterilization of tools in field hospitals, demolition cutters that slice rebar in seconds without lugging heavy gas bottles. Industrial versions integrate flame arresters, backflow sensors, and thermal interlocks so a misfire vents to a sacrificial chamber. The chemistry doesn't need to be exotic. The insight is in timing, geometry, and failsafes. Thermoregulation points toward variable emissivity skins. Dragons spread blood through wing veins to radiate heat or shunt it back to stay warm. Buildings and vehicles can do similar tricks with electrochromic or phase change coatings that switch from reflective to emissive depending on sensor input. A transit hub roof might run reflective at noon, then shift to high emission mode after sunset to purge stored heat. Facades clad in scale shingles create turbulent microflows that break up boundary layers, enhancing convective cooling without fans. Fire stations and data centers in hot zones could wrap critical rooms in that gradient shingle skin, trimming energy use while adding ember resistance. Architecture becomes sky-aware. Rooflines tilt and overhang to deny long, level perches, but they also sculpt lift and sink on purpose. Blocks can be arranged so rising thermals are channeled over parks and away from hospital helipads. Street canopies double as overhead mesh to deter stoops and as shade that flattens ground-level thermals. Exhaust stacks get baffled diffusers that split one hot plume into many cooler microjets, dulling the upward beacon that attracts curious animals and reducing heat island effects for humans. Market halls adopt scale tiles, ceramic over compliant underlayment that sheds sparks and ash during red flag days. In wildfire interfaces, homes install cool crowns, misted ridge caps and pale, patterned tiles that reduce both flame spread and skyward thermal signature. Aviation and robotics mine wing geometry. Dragons are masters of low-speed control with high-aspect wings and dynamic wingtips. Small aircraft can adopt morphing tips that twist subtly to maintain lift in gusts and improve short-field takeoffs. Ridge-soaring autopilots learn from dragon routes, coupling barometric micro-changes with thermal cameras to ride convective streets the way a glider pilot or a wyvern would. Perching drones copy tail-first landings into tight alcoves, using reversible fans and soft, compliant pads that spread loads like a membrane against rock. Rescue robots adopt membrane risers, deployable film wings that unfurl from a backpack to glide silently into canyons where rotors would echo or stall. Medicine borrows from membranes too. Elastic sutures with serpentine patterns stretch like wing fibers, preventing edge necrosis around wounds that need to flex. Burn dressings mimic the inner mouth lining, thin, hydrophilic and heat-stable so they protect tissue while letting vapor escape. Breath analyzers inspired by ignition chemistry sniff for specific hydrocarbon ratios to detect industrial leaks or diagnose metabolic disorders via volatile organic compounds. Data systems round it out. Citywide lift maps integrate rooftop temperature sensors, glider club telemetry, and ridge lidar into public dashboards. Heat dose wearables buzz firefighters and roof workers when ambient plus radiant exposure approaches unsafe thresholds, echoing how a dragon spreads wings to cool before muscles fail. Rural kits combine reflective pennants, collapsible overhead netting, and a pocket infrasound beeper set to the same brief patterns that field studies show are respected without habituation. The design language shifts. Scaly doesn't mean medieval, it means modular, gradient, and repairable. Membranous doesn't mean fragile, it means vascular, cooled, and self-healing. Controlled flame stops being spectacle and becomes a precise, low-mass tool, with interlocks at every step. Say, continue to move into everyday life vignettes and futures. A pilot, a rancher, a student, a firefighter, and a scientist living competently under a shared sky, and how the story ends depending on the choices we make.